everyone. Prof. Makoni also just wanted me to note that we have now done about 40 sessions, and we have scheduled for most of the calendar year from scholars all across the globe in diverse areas, including water, feminism, race, colorism, language, and we look forward to each and every session, and we hope that you will be able to join us for all of those sessions. So today we have the pleasure of hosting Professor Mastin Prinsloo on his talk titled Domestic Workers, Relationality and Indeterminancy, and we are really looking forward to this presentation. But before, let me just introduce, I now have the privilege to introduce Professor Mastin Prinsloo, who is an emeritus professor at the School of Education at the University of Cape Town. He does research in the fields of literacy studies, social linguistics, anthropological linguistics, and language education. Specifically, his research interests lie in literacy and language in schools, institutions, and everyday use. He has published and researched extensively into literacy. And from his very long list of publications, I will name a few. He has published 2 edited books with Christopher Stroud called Language, Literacy, and Diversity, Moving Worlds in 2015, and Education for Language and Literacy Diversity, Mobile Selves in 2014. Some of his forthcoming articles include Culture and Literacy, Situated Social Literacies with Laura Krauss, and Moving Dirt, Diffracted Boundaries and Complementarity in Domestic Workers, which we will speak about today. Prof. Prinsloo, thank you for being here with us. The floor is yours.
Thank you. At least I don't have to look at my face in large. Thank you very much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be with you. I must say, I'm not particularly used to this format of presenting. I haven't done it. I've managed to keep out of Zoom conferences since lockdown, really. So it's exciting but challenging. I decided not to use any PowerPoints because it seems crazy to have writing instead of your face when you're talking like this. And hopefully you've had a chance to glance at my paper. So what I say will be slightly more intelligible than if you just heard me speaking straight off. But the paper it's supposed to be about domestic workers in South Africa, but it's quite a bit more than that. It's really an attempt to test drive my understanding of Karen Barrad's relational onto-epistemology and see how that works, see how it helps to make sense of something like the study of domestic workers. So I'll be doing a little bit of talking about that for starters. And there are 4 chunks in the paper, and I guess I could talk for an hour on each of those chunks. So I'm going to try just to get through them. But the first part is about the theoretical perspectives of relational onto-epistemology, and the second part is looking at the literature on domestic workers in the Middle East through the lens of the kafala system. And the third chunk is just looking at some historical stuff on domestic workers in South Africa. And the fourth piece is looking at a particular case study around a court case where a domestic worker takes her employer's boyfriend to court for hate crime, for insulting and insulting her. So to start with the theoretical stuff, hopefully you know a little bit about Barad, and you'll make sense of what I try to say. It might not be clear because it's sometimes not terribly clear to me. She's a quantum physicist, and she's a feminist, and she brings these things together to develop an approach to study outside of quantum physics, a study of the social. but her key point is that her study of electrons shows that things don't exist as entities outside of their particular material discursive engagements with them. They take on particular identities depending on how they're being looked at. So electrons appear as particles through apparatuses which are designed to study position, and they appear as waves through apparatuses which are designed to study motion. And she says that we can't say that electrons consist of these two characteristics because we can't ever look at those two things together. All we can say is that through one set of material discursive practices, they are determined in this way, and through other sets of material discursive practices, they're determined in that way. And she says this approach doesn't just apply to the quantum, but also applies to the macro. And we have to say that the world is only intelligible to us, available to any forms of matter through particular cuts, through particular what she calls agential cuts. So agential cuts are where parts of the world make sense of other parts of the world through a particular material discursive cut. So we can look at one part of the world only through particular material discursive practices. So, and her point is that the basic particles, the basic elements of that we said that relations are basic to everything. We can't make sense of anything outside of relations. And that material discursive boundary making practices are what produce objects and subjects. And only objects and subjects as they are visible through those particular material discursive practices. Material discursive practices affect agential cuts. They have produced an appearance of separation between people and things, between discourse and materiality, between different kinds of people, and between individual selves across phenomena. So there's an appearance of separation when we make sense of anything. But what we are looking at are things that are entangled. And to be entangled is not to simply be intertwined with something else, but to lack an independent and self-contained existence. And that's incredibly abstract, but it also, the same relational epistemology comes up in more simple forms in particular Southern theories, in the Southern epistemologies of Escobar, for example, who looks at a man and his daughter canoeing down a river in Brazil, and talks about the reality of what's going on in that river. And he says that, in fact, it's that nothing exists, nothing there pre-exists the relations that constitute it, that everything is so incredibly intertwined. The people, the materials, the things that are coming to live in the river and outside the river and on the borders of the river are all incredibly intertwined, and it's to to make a cut, to separate any of them will produce problems for the whole ecosystem. The other point that comes out of, another point that comes out of Southern epistemology is de Souza Santos's point that whatever exists in our society also it involves an invisibilizing of things that appear not to exist. So things that don't exist are actively produced in our society. And this is very much Barad's point that when things come to matter, there's a complementary exclusion that takes place, where some things are prevented from coming to matter. So for example, we can see electrons as waves, and that the complementary identity of electrons is that of particles, and we can only see one or the other. But she points out that what's excluded doesn't always go away, and that material discursive practices are boundary-making practices which produce those cuts, but these boundaries are never clearly drawn, and that particularly at the boundaries there are overlappings and intersections and blurrings at the borders where we can, she calls them diffractions, where it's not light on one side and dark on the other, but series of light and dark bands, so that we can look at the boundaries and see instances of things that are crossing over. And the study of domestic workers, I think, is particularly interesting from within this construct of blurred borders and boundaries, because domestic workers are evidently a category of work and a category of person that are discounted. They don't seem to matter. They are categories of exploited categories of workers. At the same time, they live in very close intimacy with the people who are, in other respects, exploiting them. So there are relations of intimacy and exclusion that are very prominent within engagements amongst domestic workers. So we see these blurrings. When it comes to language, Barad's point about language is that both scientific realism and constructionist views have representational understandings of language, where objects are out there and language gets to name objects that pre-exist language, or that objects are totally produced by language in the case of reproductionist views of language. And she's her notion of agential realism says that this notion of language is inappropriate, and that what we need is more performative understanding of language. And she gets her notion of performative understanding of language from Foucault, from Derrida, and from Judith Butler in particular. So that Foucault's notion of discursive practices producing subjects that are subject to power Derrida's notion of the repetition of the sign producing our sense of the world through process of iteration, where what we take to be essences are misunderstood because it's the nature of language to produce generalities. And that's a bit obscure. It's clearer in the paper. Well, let me just move on quickly to the notion of boundaries and borders when it comes to aspects of work. When we're talking about domestic work, we're working with a whole lot of cuts, agential cuts that already precede our notion of domestic work. One of these is about production and reproduction. We work with a sense of some kinds of work as being important and some kinds of work as not being important. So since early capitalism, we've had the notion that productive work is where things are made and produced. It tends to be the work of men, and it's sustained by a lesser kind of work, which is reproductive work. And reproductive work we come to see as being largely gendered work. If we question that kind of division between productive work as being real work and reproductive work as not being real work, then we have to say that, well, the reproductive work, the kind of work that domestic workers do, and women are often seen to be responsible for, are the kinds of work that are about simultaneously natural and cultural work. It's about sustaining people in both their biological forms and in their natural forms. So domestic activity manages the interface of sociality and biology, of community and habitat. Despite all that, it's not seen as real work. Also because it's also seen as not real work because it is about caring. Caring is seen to be as something separate to outside of work. The other kind of label that it gets, domestic work gets, that it's about dirty work because it's about sorting out matter that's out of place. So these are various kinds of cuts and intersections that come to be seen as matter of fact, taken for granted, naturalized, but they are products of particular boundary forming practices, agential cuts, and sort of separations between practices which where the separations seem to be natural, but they are always only constructed and unstable. Barrett's point is, whenever cuts like this are made, things are always cut together apart because those cuts are not lasting cuts. So the together apart thing keeps on coming up when the things that are supposed to be completely separated start interfering with the things that they are separated from. And we see all these things quite strongly when we look at domestic work. So we see together and apart things happening in terms of exploitation and intimacy, or distance and intimacy happening within households and within domestic work. We see various instances of lust and loathing, where intimate relations develop between people in a context where there are very unequal categories of race and gender and ethnicity between people. We see elements of hospitality and hostility in fairly extreme forms. We see elements of respectability and servitude, and we see complicated dynamics of inside and outside. All of these things happening within language. An interesting example of how these things happen is the processes of kafala in the Middle East. Kafala is a name given to the arrangement where migrant workers get contracts of work in Middle East and Gulf countries. The kafala is a state-guaranteed system where migrant workers in large numbers, 30 million by a recent estimate, migrant workers in Gulf regions, of which a third of women workers, most of whom are domestic workers, get to work in these countries. They come from Africa, from Ethiopia and Kenya in particular, and from Asia, from the Indian subcontinent, and from Indonesia and other places. They get contracts where the contract exists, but it's state guaranteed, but it's between them and an individual sponsor. So the employer in the house that they work in is their sponsor, and their right to be in the country depends on the employer saying that this person works for me and everything is okay. So it's state sponsored, but it's an agreement between an employer and the employee. And the effect of the kafala system is that domestic workers completely disappear inside the country. They have no labor protection. They have no legal rights. They are completely subject to the goodwill of their employers. The interesting thing is kafala is a Bedouin word for hospitality. In one of and this is all taken from the literature, but the definition of kafala as a Bedouin word and of hospitality is it's about sponsoring or looking after someone, but also forming a treaty or annexing or taking control of something. So the notion of kafala includes the notion of looking after, but also taking control and being in control of. And it's almost like a coincidence that Derrida writes extensively about the term hospitality, and he says that hospitality is an interesting example of a concept in European languages where the term is actually parasitized by its opposite. That hostility and hospitality are have exactly the same root in Indo-European language. So that the enemy hosts, and the host is the person who gives hospitality, come from the same root. It comes from the hostis in Latin. So that, and Derrida says that we have an ideal construct in European languages of hospitality. And our notion of hospitality is where the guest is given unconditional hospitality, without condition and without stipulation. But he says, in fact, that never exists in practice, because the fact that the host has control over the domain always means that hospitality has conditions and limitations. And what we see in the case of domestic workers is an extreme version of these conditions and limitations. But it's also, I think, a very interesting example of how this process of cutting together apart operates, coming from Barat, where these terms within the language are inseparable. Our notions of certain things are inseparable from the things which undermine them and which present different perspectives on them. So that's one example of how these things go. And then just looking at, to move to the third part, which is just a quick look at domestic work historically, and taking within the South African context. Our sense of domestic work is that it's an activity that's done by poorly educated Black women, and this corresponds to elsewhere in the world. In the USA, domestic work was done by European white migrants first, when they were a discredited category, and then by African American women, and now predominantly by Latino women. The shifting categories of lower class or different, so the way these categories work. But so it's really interesting, and it's also a very widespread assumption that domestic work is feminized activity. It's because of the cuts that have happened historically in early stages of capitalism between male and female work, that reproductive work is female work and domestic work is a disparaged form of female work. However, across Africa in colonial times and across Asia, domestic work was predominantly done by men in colonial times. And South Africa is a good example of that. And it's still very much an activity of men in parts of the Asian subcontinent and in parts of Africa. But in South Africa, it's become Black female work. But the early days of South African industrialism in Kimberley and in Johannesburg, where the first towns of substance developed, all domestic work was done by young Black men, because these were places where there practically weren't any women. There were 10 men to every woman in the turn of the century. It was and the men were migrant laborers. But so domestic work was a organized activity where young first Zulu and then Pedi men worked in Johannesburg. What's interesting is that out of these this phenomenon of young male domestic workers in towns like Johannesburg and Durban, came the first organized gangs in South Africa, because these young men used to collect together, and in reaction to the extent to which they were underprivileged, discriminated against, badly paid, would engage in violent acts, criminal acts, stealing all kinds of things. So the modern day gangs in South Africa, the 28 gangs, 28, 27, 26 gangs, these are notoriously violent gangs in South Africa at the moment, trace their origins back to the turn of the century to domestic worker associations of men. So the extent to which these blurrings between criminality and domestic work in ways that are just not visible now are really interesting. It's also because of a labor shortage on the mines in the early 20th century, the white mine owners decided it would be a good idea to get some domestic workers from England, some women who could really do the work. And tens of thousands of white women domestic workers were imported from England in the early decades of the 20th century, and worked in Johannesburg. What's interesting is that it was a fairly brief episode, because most of them didn't stay as domestic workers for very long, because they came to see that this level of disparate work tended to be racialized work. So they were seeing themselves diminished on a footing with Black people who were seen to be lesser people in these contexts. And also, they were mobile. They could be upwardly mobile because there were so few women in these regions, and they could all marry. And they all married and got outside of domestic work. It was really only the 1930s and 1940s that a big effort was made to encourage Black women to become domestic workers. And the people who recruited them tried to do all kinds of things to set up training programs for them and so on. There'd never been any training programs for the men. Despite the fact that men had no training in domestic work, whereas all these women were being trained by their mothers as to do cleaning and to care for children. But nonetheless, it's not taken for granted that domestic work in South Africa is done by poorly educated Black women. And I won't go into any more detail on that because I'm running out of time. Just to go quickly over this case study that I look at. This is about a court case between a domestic worker in the northern suburbs of Capetown, who had been a full-time domestic worker and nanny in a house working for a middle-class woman who worked in the hotel industry. And her job was to clean this relatively small house and look after the two children in the house. And she stayed in the house because she was a full-time nanny. And this woman's boyfriend at one point moved into this house and didn't like the fact that she was living in the house as well, didn't get on with her. And there was conflict between her and this man at various points. And he insulted her and assaulted her, and she took him to court. She went to see the Domestic Workers Union, and they got her a lawyer, and she opened a case against him. And I'll just give a description of what happens in this case, focusing on aspects of language in this case. What's interesting is partly is how she describes the conflict between her and the employer, and secondly, how she responds to the language of the court. But in preparation for the court case, her lawyer says to her, I want you to go on the stand and let them know exactly how you feel. I want them to show your anger and so on. And she says, that's fine. Can I speak Xhosa? Because Xhosa is my language. And he says, no, please don't speak Xhosa, speak English. And that would appear to be a transgression of one of the basic human rights that are entrenched in the South African Constitution, which are that people have a right to speak their mother tongue, particularly in court. There are court interpreters available so that people can say what they want to say in their first language. And the lawyer says, no, please speak in English. And he said, and I want you to show your anger. So she does the court case in English. And we interviewed and said, how did that go? Which is, but the people were crying when I was talking because they were sympathizing with what I said. I told the court what happened with this guy, and they believed me. So the question of the mother tongue is interesting because the debate there seems to be between the lawyer and the domestic worker seems to be a discussion about language medium. But if we think about language and performativity, it's really about performance. When court interpreters are translating what people say in their first language, they focus on denotation. They focus on the meaning of what people are saying, and they try to put that meaning into the court language or into English. But if we understand language as something that people do, then the performative dimensions of language are important. And and in Barad's terms, when we are speaking, we are performing a particular cut of ourselves. And the particular cut that the domestic worker, Gloria, has to perform in court is her as the angry domestic worker. And she can do that in English, and she can do that articulately in the discredited register of English, which she has and which she speaks, because that identifies her as a domestic worker. And she's been speaking English for for decades at least in the household. But the point about the mother tongue that Derrida makes is, and he calls it the so-called mother tongue. He says, in moments of insecurity, we want to speak the mother tongue because when we speak that mother tongue, we feel that we can hear ourselves speaking ourselves. But he says that's a fantasy, even though it's the most unbreakable of fantasies, because language, the mother tongue is never our language anyway. We always get it from the other. When we get language, we also are getting a cut. So we are, in Barad's terms, a cut is happening. We are cut together apart. So we're always taking on a particular material discursive identity. So we're always cut together apart, and whenever we are speaking and acting, we are overcoming our indeterminacy and realizing a particular cut of ourselves, which is a material discursive cut realized through language and action and material discursive practices. And that's her. So that's my take on how Barad and Derrida come together to make sense of how this domestic worker gets to identify the conflict between herself and her assailant in court. But in her defense, in his defense, the lawyer for the employer tries to make out that the domestic worker's relationship with the employer is much better, was better than the domestic worker was saying. He said, no, you used to sit together with this guy on the couch and watch cricket together, and you all get excited. And when the South Africans are doing well, you jump up and cheer and clap hands and everything. So the guy's lawyer was trying to present them as unified, cutting them together. And her response to what the lawyer said, yeah, okay, maybe we jump up together, but I wasn't jumping up for him. I was jumping up because I was excited. If he jumps up, that's for himself. I wasn't using his eyes to look at what was going on. I was using my eyes. She was insisting on her separation from him. That was her defense. That was her response. She was insisting on cutting herself apart from him. But in terms of what Barad says, because they are part of the same material discursive practice, they are cut together apart within this phenomenon of a court case. And in terms of domestic work within the households, this is what we see as well. Domestic workers and their employers within the phenomenon of the household are cut together apart. So overlapping of intimacy and hostility. And we see this in all kinds of things through intimate sexual relationships between domestic workers and various categories of employer. And there's a famous court case from the 1970s when 19 people in a small town were prosecuted, domestic workers and white Afrikaans males for immorality. It was illegal for blacks and whites to have sex. And these people were in sexual relationships that had children. And there was very clearly, some of these white men were leaders of the Nationalist Party who were putting in these racial laws. And there's a very moving book by Zygmunt Da about this particular encounter between these white men and these domestic workers. And he discusses what's going on as an overlap of lust and loathing, the way these things overlap, this cutting together and cutting together apart. This hostility and hospitality, the way these things are merging, and the way we could only make the way our discourses sometimes, in fact always, exclude some things that are very much part of what's going on. And those things that are excluded erupt into what's going on in complicated ways at various times and produce these sorts of explosions that happen in these particular court cases. So that's a really garbled overview of my paper in terms of these agential cuts. What Barat says is this is all these things are examples of entanglement. And entanglement is not when separate things get mixed up together, but where things that are not proper, that are separate, are entangled, not properly separate. Entanglement is entanglement of things which only get their determination within these entanglements. So this is what the relational ontology is about. These things only happen within relations. And if you try to separate them from their relations, they don't have meaning. I'm going to stop there.
Thanks a lot. Thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot, Mastin. So, Sinfree, we yield the floor to you.
Oh, okay. Thank you very much, Mastin. Let me ask one simple question first as an entry into this discussion. In your paper, you talk about Barat's work, the post-humanistic orientation to the socio-material practices in Barat's work. Can you elaborate a little bit on that? Is there a post-humanistic orientation to Barat's work? And if so, what form does it take?
Thanks. Shall I go straight ahead?
Yes, yes.
Post-humanist is a bit of a scare word because you think, oh, what's up? We're moving into the world of cyberborgs and beyond the human into something else. But to some extent, as Alistair Pennycook talks about it, post-human is also about post-humanist. It's about moving beyond some of the humanist assumptions where human is centered unproblematically in the world, and what a whole lot of post-humanist or new materialist work is trying to take account of is the extent to which the materiality of the world is not sufficiently taken account of in in a lot of Western epistemological work, and that the material and the fact of the body in the form of human people, in the form of humans, matters a lot more than was taken account of in earlier discussions. So that Barad is a post-humanist, but her emphasis is on matter. Her notion is that human is part of the world, and she insists on the materiality of the human, and she doesn't want to make any sharp distinction between human activity and other aspects of the world mattering, and she tries to develop a sense of understanding, where understanding is a material discursive process. Understanding is not something that happens in language, but language needs to be more substantially understood as a material activity. That it's about material discursive cuts. I should stop there, otherwise it's going to get more and more obscure.
Okay, let me continue with it. Then the other issue, the other concept that you touch on in your paper and in Barad's, which Barad talks about, is the idea that nothing pre-exists the relations that constitute it. So does that apply to relations, let's say, between humans and other species, or this is only between humans and humans? That nothing pre-exists relations that constitute it, but it looks like from that framing, it is the relations that construct the entities. Am I getting it correct?
Yes, the relations are primary.
Yes, the relations are primary, that the individuals or the units are to some extent the product or the consequences of the relations.
And that applies to absolutely everything. That the cuts we make between people and animals, and between sentient entities and non-sentient entities, these are all agential cuts. Yes. So that the relations are primary. Yes.
Okay, so if in these relations which are primary, to quote your way, because you also use the phrase, I think it's from Law, one world, meaning that and Law is critical of the idea that we live in one world, that we live in multiple worlds, multiple realities. Are you then saying that it is possible for individuals who live in multiple worlds to have relations, right? That these individuals who have relations but belong to different universes. In other words, to use your term fractiverse, or I think which seems to be similar to Minolo's pluriversality, that you can have a relationship which cuts across different universes, so to speak.
Well, yes, certainly. So if we look at say the Amazon, and it's as a world which has varied, where everything operating there is in relationship to everything else and takes on all kinds of distinctive things. We can look at that as a world of some sort.
Yes.
But it's not. But phenomena overlap in various ways. So we can see overlapping phenomena. If say pine loggers or oil companies move into that region, then we see the effects of overlapping phenomena or different worlds coming in. So what happens then that these things that were constituted within these relations get reformed by other kinds of relationships happening, so that all kinds of things. What things that were in ecological harmony get disrupted by this other world that enters in and produces all kinds of discords and side effects and so on. So it's effect of overlapping phenomena. Phenomena are material discursive practices are not lasting and are ephemeral and are overlapping. It can be disrupted.
That can be disrupted. Okay, then my last question before I hand over to Basi, and then other people may come in. These relations can be relations of conflict, struggle, etc. They don't necessarily have to be amicable relations. Right. What I'm trying to do is to see to what extent the work by Bonaventura dos Santos might be connected with Barrett's work. For Bonaventura dos Santos, the critical issue would be struggle, for example. So if I frame struggle in terms of relations, I would then say, if I'm to adopt a Barredian view on Bonaventura dos Santos, a struggle constitutes a particular type of relations. People who are competing against each other, right? But it is still a form of relationship that is unfolding, yeah.
Yes.
What I'm trying to do is this. I'm trying to see to what extent Barrett's notions of quantum physics can be useful in a development of Southern theories, particularly Bonaventura's work that you cite to some extent in your work.
Yes, well, for Barrett, conflicts come where the effects of various kinds of exclusions erupt. So material discursive practices tend to be relations between things that are not in conflict. However, the things that are excluded within those relations can erupt into those practices and produce conflicts. So Barrett is very attentive to the exclusionary processes that certain material discursive practices produce. So she sees conflict as coming out of the way exclusions happen, and that's very close to what De Souza Santos says about the way things are produced. Also, the way things that are not there are also actively produced within society. And that's where the conflict happens, between those things that are not actively not produced and the way there's an unstable relationship between those things.
Things are produced. Okay, thanks a lot. Let me stop here and then allow other people to come in. Basi.
Okay, thanks a lot. Thanks, Sinfree. We have 2-3 comments, questions for you, Mastin. There's one from Mary, who is interested in you elaborating on the material aspects involved in the court case you described, where the domestic worker takes the boyfriend of the employer to court. She says, languaging in the court case obviously involves materiality, in other words, performativity. but she's interested in how you understand materiality in the material discursive practices of the court case.
Yes. I think that what's very important about the lawyer's intervention in a court case is to emphasize that he wants the domestic worker to perform her domestic workerness when she gives evidence. So it's he says we want to feel your anger. We must you have to, it has to, it's not just what you say, it has to be your physical presence, your embodiment of your anger. It's so for Barad, language is always material embodiment, and I guess I could have explored, if I'd had the visuals, to a greater extent, the physical, material aspects of the language encounter. But it's very clear that the notion of language as merely representational or as denoting meaning is disqualified and replaced there by a notion of language as embodied performance. So that's where the material discursive aspects of language come into that court case.
Okay, thank you very much. Then Bonnie would like to know how Barad and other new materialists theorize power.
Interesting. Barad doesn't talk about power very directly, as far as I can tell, because of her concern with just translating quantum physics into sociality, but I guess her notion of power is that power is an effect of material discursive practices that cause some things to matter rather than other things. So she sees, as a feminist, she sees that she follows Butler's work to see gender as a product of iterative practice, where gender differences are a product of iterability, of people just doing things over and over within particular material discursive practices. So her notion of power, I guess, would be closer to Foucault's notion of power, but with a greater sense of the materiality of discursive practices. So power is the effect of iterative practices within particular phenomena, which are material discursive practices, where certain things come to matter and certain things are excluded from mattering. And that's how power under those conditions work.
Okay.
I guess.
All right. Thanks a lot, Mastin. And Lynn Mario probably has a comment or two.
Yeah, thank you, Bassy. Thank you, Mastin, for that interesting, very provocative. It certainly made me think in relation to my work. And going on from the previous questions on that Bonnie just asked and that Sintri had raised as well about power. Here I'm speaking from the perspective of my work in decolonial theory. So I read Barad a long time ago, and I didn't come back to her. But basically, what I understand from your reading of her is what she's saying through relationality and the various meaning of matter matters, right? Is that we have heterogeneity before homogeneity. And whenever homogeneity appears or claims to exist, it's basically a denial or an invisibilizing of heterogeneity, of the plural.
Yes.
And in that sense, that is how I see it from a decolonial perspective of how power plays out. It's in the denial of relationality and the decreeing of invisibility, because there are basically two kinds of invisibility. One is a positive, I'd call it a positive invisibility, which decolonial theory has long talked about. Sousa Santos talks about when he talks about his abyssal line, or Fanon talks about when he says that there's a zone of being and not being. It's a positive invisibility when those in power deny the existence or hide the existence of their bodies behind their enunciations. So their enunciations become, their knowledge and their language become universal because the matter of their bodies is invisibilized, right? So that disconnects whatever they're producing from a particular locality through the production of through housed by a particular body. So they, at a certain point, those in power immaterialize their beings in order to universalize and impose their truth. At the same time, they produce a negative form of invisibility, which is the visibility that they deny to those they relegate to the zone of non-being, right? So that's a negative form of invisibility, because they see those bodies are made visible, but what those bodies do or say is invisibilized. So the visibility of those bodies, or the material nature of those bodies, gets attributed a negative value. So that there's an interesting play between, a relationality even between the matter of the more powerful, which is invisibilized, their bodies are invisibilized, whereas the bodies of the less powerful are made visible, but with a lesser value.
Yes.
Now this is, we have, I'm saying this because it's one of our Brazilian Black feminist activists, Lélia Gonzalez, who is now deceased. She was the daughter of a domestic worker. She's a Black Brazilian, a daughter of a domestic worker who became a university lecturer and an academic. Now, she wrote extensively on racism in Brazil. And like decolonial theory, she saw racism as a denial of racial relationality, right? And going back to Aníbal Quijano's idea of coloniality of the body, where racism is not a matter of race, it's a matter of the denial of the hierarchy in the relationality established between different social groups, and race is only a metonym for the relationality behind this. Now, what Lelia Gonzalez does is she recuperates something, and here I'm trying to get back to the notion of language. She recuperates a very strong denial in relation to Brazilian Portuguese of the influence of the enslaved Black Africans and the effect that they had on Brazilian spoken Portuguese. So there are strong indications that in Brazilian spoken Portuguese, you don't follow the grammatical rules which say that number, person, and gender have to be marked on going from the articles to the pronouns and the verb, etc. What happens in spoken Brazilian Portuguese is these are just marked at the beginning through the article, and then there's no marking at all. Now, there are strong indications that this has come from the influence of the Africans, the enslaved Africans who were brought to Brazil and were not allowed to speak their languages, and they were obliged to learn haphazardly Portuguese, which was European Portuguese at the time. And so they learned it, bringing in, they were not allowed to attend school, so they had no formal instruction in Portuguese. And for 300 years, the Black African population in Brazil was the majority of the population in Brazil in numbers, right? And so other immigrants, non-Portuguese speaking immigrants, white immigrants who came into Brazil, who were generally poor and illiterate, they learned Portuguese from these Black Africans or descendants of the Black Africans. Now that is there are strong indications of this, which is denied by Brazilian linguistics, right? Brazilian linguistics says that Brazilian Portuguese is a direct descendant of European Portuguese. This may be true in terms of literate written Portuguese, but certainly not true in terms of spoken Portuguese. Right? So there's this undercurrent, racist, I read it as a racist undercurrent of denying the African influence on Brazilian spoken Portuguese, which this Lelia Gonzalez, this feminist Black anti-racist activist, took up in her writings, and she called, she used a word which, before I say what the word is, I have to explain that Portuguese in Portuguese is called português, and the word for Black, we have two words for Black in Portuguese. One is negro, which is neutral, and the other word is preto, which is derogatory. So Black people are referred to as pretos in a derogatory manner, or as negros in a neutral manner. Now she creates the word, Lelia Gonçalves creates the word português, playing with the word preto and Portuguese. And she says this phenomenon of denying the importance of the Black in Brazilian culture and language, and she reads it as a neurosis, the denying of the relationality, or the denying of the interconnection or the reality, which would be the neurotic theory. And she takes three examples, coming here now to your topic of the domestic worker. She takes the example of the Black woman in Brazilian culture. She says, the Black woman in Brazilian culture has three interconnected but consciously separated manifestations. You have the mulata, which is the sexualized, genderized Black woman, right? The mulata who appears half nude in carnival parades, the mulata who's used in advertising to sell things, right? The mulata who's a stereotype of the sexualized Black woman. So but that mulatta is not allowed to open her mouth to say anything. So that mulatta doesn't interact. Then you have the domestic worker, the black woman domestic worker, who is also not allowed to say anything. She is totally invisibilized. She doesn't interact. She's underpaid, doesn't interact, and invisibilized. And the third manifestation of the black woman in Brazilian culture is the black nanny, who is not sexualized, not genderized. She doesn't do anything apart from look after the white children. And she lives in the family. She is the object of affect in the family. She is always there at the kids' birthday parties. She's remembered long after the kids have grown up. Right? Now, she's a positive. The black nanny is this chubby, wonderful-looking, positive-looking. So you have these three manifestations of black women, and what Lelia Gonçalves shows is how they are interconnected manifestations of the role that black women play in Brazilian culture. And she says, why are they denied? Why are black women basically treated as subservient or as sexual objects? Because if you connect, as she tries to connect, the mulatta, the sexualized mulatta, with her sexual functions, with the domestic worker who makes sure the home is run functionally, and the black nanny who gives all the emotion and affect that the mother doesn't, that the white mother doesn't. She's there for the kids all the time. Then what you see is the power of the black woman in Brazilian culture. And if this power is recognized, this black woman would desexualize the macho white male, because she does two things. She desexualizes the macho white male, and she displaces the white woman from her basic functions as her cultural functions in white society, right? And so she calls attention to the importance of the anti-racist feminist movements to recuperate these three figures, which come out through the domestic worker, right? To deny the masculinity of the black image, of the white male image, on which racism is based in Brazil. I'm wondering if there's something similar that in your work.
Yes, I mean,
because you mentioned the lusting and the loathing, right?
Yes, the overlaps are considerable. But what's interesting is that for the self-construction of black domestic workers in South Africa since 1930s, 1940s into the 50s, that women who've been influenced by Christian missionaries, by who'd been cut away from a particular kind of ethnic or tribal identity and had embraced a certain type of Christianity, saw domestic work as a site of respectable work. So domestic work was respectable work compared to other kinds of informal work, because the only work available to black women was informal work, because formal work was only available to migrant male workers, black male workers. So a lot of women who, because women had to work, were doing other things, and the major activities there outside of domestic work were illegal beer brewing, to provide sorghum beer, which is an indigenous brew of beer, sorghum beer to migrant workers, black migrant workers, a huge industry which was frowned upon and persecuted by the police. So they were disreputables. So the disreputable activities that they, but a lot of women were going into were beer brewing and working as washerwomen, just taking in clothes and just washing them in large quantities. So domestic work was a site for Christianized women who aspired to respectability. So the extent to which it's a disparaged activity is contradicting the tensions between those things. But it's also interesting that the domestic workers union, when it organizes domestic workers, leaves out so much of what domestic worker discourses, identities, practices, materialities, performances are about. It tries to organize them as discriminated and abused workers, as if that's a sufficient basis on which to organize them. And it can't deal with all the other connections that these people have. So the leader of the Domestic Workers Union in South Africa is also the president of the International Domestic Workers Union. She's sponsored by ILO and all kinds of things, and she was part of the big official declarations of domestic work is decent work, as if these things were going to change the activities. So the notion that what makes domestic workers is complicated. It's not a simple thing of they are this and they are just like that. And it's and certain outside cuts perform them in certain kinds of ways which are not working. So it's the same with setting up various kinds of training courses for domestic workers, as if they need to be shown how to take care of children, or how to clean houses, or how to speak English, all these language classes, or how to read and write, as if disconnected bits of reading and writing are meaningful interventions into these things. So yes, I guess there are overlaps, but substantial differences across the two contexts. There always are when we look at South America and South Africa.
Okay, thanks a lot, Mastin. A couple of comments here. Well, Mary thanks you for nicely connecting Barad pro-structural concepts in Southern theory and finds that really brilliant. But she also poses a question, and she says there are different types of theorization within post-humanist theory. And she'd like to know why you chose Barad over Deleuze and Guattari. Was it because of the more critical slant in Barad's work?
The simple answer is I have real trouble understanding Deleuze and Guattari. Whereas Barad is incredibly clear. I think that Deleuze and Guattari are complementary in some ways to Barad, in terms of they say things that are similar to her, but also very different. So, and I'd like to explore that more. But there's not much Deleuze and Guattari in me, in my work, except via the influences of other people who've made better sense of Deleuze and Guattari than me. But an interesting difference that I've picked up is that Barad stresses the ethical much more than Deleuze and Guattari. Deleuze and Guattari have a greater sense of discord and destruction in terms of in material connectivities, whereas Barad has a greater focus on ethical dimension. And I don't know. I think it's probably somewhere in between those two. But the answer is I don't know Deleuze and Guattari well enough to. And I've just been working with Barad quite recently.
Okay, then, like Magda did announce at the beginning, we have come to the more formal end of this party, but the real party, the after hours, just now. So in the after party session, we would be recording, and that part will no longer be moderated. So in a sense, we are just welcome to continue to engage with Mastin. And I see Sally Coco has a comment he would like to make.